For this first slide, I just wanted to give you a preview of the weather tomorrow. So as you can see, it's looking really nice. Yeah, it's just themed. So React Native was released now, over 1,000 days ago, March 26, 2015. So it's coming up to the anniversary, I guess, at this point. And something that happens usually when software is first released, there is often a lot of hype, and inevitably around hype there is a lot of disappointment. So I imagine there are a good number of people in this room who maybe tried React Native when it was first released, or some time in the first year or so afterwards, and maybe ran into some of these issues. So you found that it was buggy, or didn't handle your use case, or there weren't really good resources for learning. And of course, the breaking changes, those can be pretty brutal. It's getting better now, though. All these issues just combine, and it's, like I say, it's not unique to this project. It's every new project, every new open source ambitious software project has a lot of these same problems. But what I'm going to talk about is 11 reasons why you should maybe try React Native again or not. And I guess you guys were kind of tricked because this is the React meetup and not the React Native meetup, which was just mentioned. So yeah, sorry about that. I guess it's not really me, though. OK, first reason. I'm actually going to go through this pretty quickly because I'm also going to talk about navigation so that Eric can talk about something else afterwards. So excuse the speed. Feel free to talk to me afterwards. So the first reason, it's super easy to try it, and especially if you already know React, like all of you do here. You can go to snack.expo.io, open a simulator in your browser, and change some code right there. You can install NPM packages there. You can drag files in, like images or whatever, and basically just give it a go and see if you like it, see if it seems like it might be something interesting for you. It's also pretty easy to try just using Expo here or create React Native app. You don't need to install any of the native build tools. You can just install this package through NPM and install an app on your phone, and you're able to get going running the project pretty quickly. I sped it up also there, as you can see. I'm actually not that fast at typing. All right, I did this at Pivotal Labs, so Pivotal, so there you go. So another good reason is you might not have to write any of these things that you probably all don't know anything about at all, really. And I think this wasn't necessarily true when React Native was first released. Like I mentioned, there were some use cases that were not covered by it. And that often required that you learn a bit about these various languages as well as their associated frameworks on iOS and Android, so that you would bridge these APIs into JavaScript and then sort of maintain this thing and update it and so on. But you don't really need that as much anymore. There are a lot of good libraries out there. The ecosystem is definitely improving. If you use Snack, which I showed you before, or create React Native app, you have all of these things out of the box in addition to everything that comes included into React Native. So there's really a lot that you can do without needing to even learn about any native code whatsoever. Some fun things like this, like even you can use the AR kit, not all the features of AR kit, but some of the features like making ducks floating in water. And there's some example app that shows some other stuff right there. You can use WebGL, or at least most of WebGL features. You can use that to create like image filters or 3D games. However, a caveat there is no JIT in JSC on iOS, and so the performance is not as good as it could be in that situation. And that's just the limitation of the iOS API that exposes JSC for security reasons, is my understanding. So third reason, perfect for your next hobby or hack day project. So you can actually build a project and just publish it like this. You don't need to create an app store account or Play Store account and just run. It's kind of like how you can run Now using, probably a lot of you have seen Now SH. Just run like exp publish, gives you this website with some logo there, scan this QR code, open the app, share it with your friends, don't share it with anybody, up to you. It's just all there and you don't really have to do that much. So here are some kind of hobby projects. I made this one on the right for finding breweries in Vancouver. Someone else, a guy named John, built this for coffee. Yeah, this is just another one. So, oh yeah, of course you can also deploy it to the App Store or Play Store using these tools. So there are plenty of apps that have battle tested it. I don't really think we need to talk about this too much. Probably a lot of people have heard about some of these apps. The developer tools and integrations are getting a lot better. So one example is Visual Studio Code. Integrates just really well. There's good autocomplete. You can debug in VS Code. You can do all sorts of really cool things. And I imagine Nuclide is also good, but honestly, I don't use it, so I can't say. You can use tools you're already familiar with, like Chrome for profiling. You can also use Chrome for debugging. And so the way that that works, as a brief sort of aside, is that you essentially run the JavaScript for your app inside of Chrome and then communicate over IPC using just JSON. So that's kind of cool. You have access to React DevTools, which you can use in a familiar way to kind of explore your component hierarchy and edit different styles and whatnot. I think that's, yeah, sure. Okay. Hot reloading. So this all just comes like out of the box. You don't have to configure anything. Hot reloading just works. At least when it works, it works. If you've ever used hot reloading in the browser, same kind of problems can arise on occasion. But it does generally work pretty well. OK, so some caveats. Using React Native, so navigation and routing still not completely solved. Eric and I are working on this, trying to improve the state of kind of routing libraries in React Native. But it's a common issue that people encounter, is that they, it's not something that you're necessarily used to coming from a web background of having to deal with some ambiguity around how you go from one page to another, and that being a choice you have to make. Everyone just chooses React Router, and that's fair. That's an excellent choice for the web. It's a little more complicated in native, and I'll talk about that more shortly. Debugging and profiling is not as easy. You have your code essentially running in JavaScript, and then you have this other runtime in native on iOS and Android, which you may or may not be super familiar with the internals of. So if something goes wrong there, you might not know really what's going on. And the action that triggered it might come from JavaScript and then follow through to native and then come back to JavaScript. And like, how do you trace that? You can't really step through that in every step of the way. So that's a little difficult. The community is growing a lot, but it's still, I mean, compared to native or web, which are just the biggest communities around, it's still relatively small. And so, although you will get help if you ask in the right places and provide well-structured questions and whatnot, if that, it's not as big as other communities. And another one, it just might not be a good fit for you. So if you're going to invest a huge amount of resources as a company into a mobile app, you definitely should consider, like, do you have developers that already know Objective-C or C++ or C enough that like they'd be comfortable in that environment to be making an app on iOS, or I guess Swift or similar languages? Or you're already familiar with Java? Do you only need to build an app for iOS and not for Android? Things like that. It all really just depends. So definitely evaluate the options, because there are trade-offs for what you decide to do there. Another one is if you already have an existing app and you have that expertise, definitely the kind of value of React Native is a little bit diminished, because it does add some complexity to your existing app. And then Expo, which is this, I didn't even mention really what it is so far, but you can maybe infer it from some of the stuff I've discussed. So Expo is kind of like this framework for built on top of React Native for kind of trying to be like Rails for React Native. So we give you a bunch of stuff. We give you like a solid story around how you deploy things and update your app, and give you this set of like sort of a standard library on top of the existing React Native core. But there are some caveats to that as well. There's some limitations with the API. Not all native APIs are available. As you saw before, there's a pretty big set, but you might need to use some other random APIs throughout your app. And a couple of other things that I'll post these slides later. You can review that one. The last one that's kind of important, and this one just actually came up today, is that you saw on a previous slide there's this thing called Expo Client, which I scanned the QR code with, and then it opened the app on the phone. So we're getting a little bit, perhaps unsurprisingly, a pushback from Apple after a couple of years of being on the App Store with that. And so in the future, you might have to install the app on your computer with Xcode or perhaps some other mechanism. We're just working through that with Apple right now for what is the best approach. Next, there's a growing ecosystem of libraries. So some bigger companies are getting involved in this space. AWS is investing a bunch in making sure their services integrate really well with React Native, for example. And really, most services that you can think of, like Realm offers a React Native client. Realm is like the most popular mobile database tool. Algolia provides some examples of how to integrate their search API into React Native apps. If you want to have a look at some of the libraries that exist out there, you can go to native.directory, and there's just a sort of curated list of various things that are available. And the code sharing story with web. There's definitely some pretty cool stuff happening here, including with a couple of people in this room who showed me some neat things that they're working on today. Maybe he'll talk about that sometime at React Boston. And Eric will talk about it a bit more later as well, so I won't belabor this point too much. But the Twitter PWA, for example, is written using React Native Web. So this is used by millions of people, and they chose React Native Web because it happens to be a very good way to build web apps, surprisingly. There's a lot of information on the repo about why that is, so you can dig into that there. But essentially, you're able to reuse a lot of your components if they depend on sort of these primitives that exist on all platforms, like Vue, Text, Image, some Animations API, and a couple of other things. If you implement your components just depending on those, you can reuse them really well between platforms. And so what you end up with is that you're able to build this set of components that you can share between different platforms, like icon, modal, button, select. This Venn diagram is taken from the Major League Soccer blog post that they did about universal components. They do a similar thing. Their app is built with React Native, and they use their React Native components on the web as well in a bunch of places. If you want to give it a try really quickly, you can run create React Native app and with the with web support flag and just specify this alpha scripts version, and you'll basically be good to go in writing some code that'll run in the web and iOS and Android. The gesture and animation APIs are really awesome. It's super fun to play with. You're kind of limited in what you could do in the browser in terms of building performant animations and performant gestures, especially when you're linking the animations to gesture events and scroll events and that kind of thing. And one of the really fun things about React Native is that it does give us this kind of space to experiment with the sort of lower level details and then expose a JavaScript API to it. So it's almost like you're able to iterate on the internals of like the web browser and then test this implementation as that's happening. And so there are sort of like a bunch of different things going on where people are experimenting with different ideas on how we can do animations and gestures better. And I think there's been some really interesting stuff done here. So you can check out the animated API in React Native and also a project called React Native Gesture Handler, which is really great. Easy workflow, sharing progress. So with React Native, you may or may not know, you can publish the updated JavaScript for your app, and then your app can download that over the air and get an update without having to go through the App Store. That is actually completely allowed by the App Store, as long as it doesn't significantly change the functionality of the app. So if you're changing from like an app for children to learn the alphabet to like a slot machine app or something like that, that's obviously, for various reasons not going to be acceptable. But it is actually okay to do that. And people have been doing this now for years in React Native and in various other tools. Expo gives you some other stuff on top of that, like release channels. Actually, this one's probably more interesting there. So this kind of gives you out of the box this idea of having like a staging environment, a production environment, and all you have to do when you publish a new version of the bundle, it gives you this other URL, and you can send a link to somebody and say, hey, try out this staging version of the app. For this React navigation library, we have it set up to automatically deploy every pull request to a different release channel. So anytime someone submits a pull request, we get a QR code, we can scan it and try our example app with the new code, which is pretty handy. And so you can set that up on your CI really easily as well. It's like a few lines of code for it. Next slide. Yeah, talked about that one, the last part. Okay, and the 11th point, plenty of learning resources. So there's really a lot more out there than there was to begin with. Egghead, probably at least a few people in this room use this regularly, and there's a bunch of stuff for React Native on there, and increasingly more so. There's this really good book, Learn React Native. There's this other one that is also good that might get out of date more quickly because it's a paper book, but they're both good options. There's reactnativeexpress.com, so if you just want to get up and running really quickly and learn the basics, you can go there. If my voice isn't annoying enough, or I'm not an annoying person to you, you can look at my 2-day workshop that I did at React Europe last year, and that's entirely up on YouTube for free. And yeah, so how to get started, basically just go to reactnativeexpress.com, read some stuff there. If you like what you see, play with it and snack. And from there, if you want to continue, just head over to the React Native docs and look at how to get started to build the app on your machine. Cool. So that's that one. How much time did that take? Are we good for another one? Okay.
Take your time.
All right. So we promised a certain set of topics we were going to cover, and Eric had some really cool stuff he wanted to talk about that wasn't in those topics. So instead, yeah, I'm going to talk about those things, and then he's going to talk about something else. Okay, so mobile navigation. This is from our lecture at Harvard that we did yesterday, so you can ignore that slide. So what is navigation? What is this idea of navigation? It's a pretty broad term, right? It doesn't really have any specific definition, but you can more or less think of it as how you go from one screen to another screen in your app, or how you navigate, how you move between screens. So web navigation is pretty oriented around URLs. You change the URL bar. That is then seen as go get this page, or this is now the current location, and then the page updates in response to that to reflect whatever screen is appropriate for that URL. Mobile apps don't really use URLs. It's not really a concept that exists for the most part, with the exception of when you're linking into an app from the outside. But in terms of moving around within the app itself, URLs aren't used really almost at all, except maybe in some weird cases. So another problem with navigation APIs on iOS, or in React Native rather, is that they are completely different on iOS and Android. And so not only are the navigation patterns different, but really they could not be more different. Everything about the navigation APIs are completely distinct on iOS and Android. And so what needs to be done there is just like the rest of React Native, where we don't ask you to know the distinction between how to render an image on Android and how to render an image on iOS. You just use an image tag, and then we deal with the underlying details for you. We need to have some kind of equivalent to that for navigation in React Native. And so there are several libraries that attempt to kind of provide this abstraction for you. And we're going to talk about React navigation. So to give you another quick look at what I mean by navigation, right? We scroll through a website, click on something, URL changes, website changes. We're all familiar with this flow. Nothing particularly fancy. We have a back button, we have a forward button, we have a refresh button. There's a URL bar. On mobile, you have a way to swipe back, and you can swipe forward. I believe on desktop, depending on the computer that you have as well, you can swipe back on your trackpad. And so you get a lot of this sort of UI and logic built into your application for you in kind of the shell of the application. And that is not at all the case on mobile. On mobile, or rather in mobile apps, you essentially have full control over the UI and the behavior of how you move between screens in the app. And this is really great, but on the other hand, it does require you to learn a bit more when you're getting started. You can't quite just think immediately, I'm going to go to this URL and this page will change. So the patterns I'm showing here are one very common pattern having a tab bar. We switch between tabs, the screen switches. Let's just play that again. When you tap on one of the items in one of the screens, it will sometimes push a screen over top of everything. Sometimes the screen will slide in within, underneath the tab bar, and then as you switch to another tab and go back, that needs to be there in that spot, as well as remembering the state of all the other tabs that you're in. So it's a little bit more of a complicated problem than web navigation. And yeah, we need to have a good solution for that. So that's why we're working on React Navigation. And hey, it's freezing again on the same spot. That's great. Almost. There we go. So I think it's worth talking about briefly the alternatives as well first. As I mentioned, there are a few libraries that attempt to solve this. And they mostly fit into these two categories. First is they're implemented mainly in JavaScript with React. That is what React Navigation does. And the second is they're implemented mostly in native, and we simply expose an interface to JavaScript that wraps those APIs in a way that tries to kind of flatten over the differences as much as possible. There are various trade-offs associated with that. I linked to this document in our docs called pitch and anti-pitch. So we try to be very upfront about what we think the trade-offs are, and we hope that other libraries do that more often as well. So check that out if you are seriously looking into building a React Native app and want to get some informed ideas about what library you should choose. So the first step, we install React Navigation, obviously. Currently, there's a beta version of 2.0. I didn't really want to teach people old stuff, so I'm just probably next week or the week after we'll release the final version of 2.0, so I just stuck with that one for now. So there are some key concepts to learn about in React Navigation. There's navigators, routes, and screen components. So a navigator is a component that implements a specific navigation pattern. So in the example we saw, tabs, that would be a tab navigator. Within that, you have some way to navigate between screens inside of a kind of history stack. That would be a stack navigator, and so on. So each navigator must have one or more routes. So you say this tab has a home tab, it has a settings tab, has all these other kind of things. And the route is considered to be a child of the navigator. Each route must have the same, or must have a name and a screen component. And the name is typically unique across the app. So that's kind of like saying this specific key refers to this screen, regardless of where that is nested within this hierarchy. There can be exceptions to that later, but by the time that becomes a thing, you will probably have the intuition necessary to understand why there is why you might want that to be an exception. The screen component is just a React component, and the screen component can also be another React component that is a navigator. That is kind of a weird sounding thing, so let's just look at what that sort of means by adding a navigator to just an empty app. So the most simple navigator is a switch navigator, and what it does essentially is it displays one screen at a time. Inactive screens are unmounted, and the only action a user could take is say, go from this screen to this screen, and now go to this screen, and so on. It's kind of like the switch router in React Router. So pretty much just looks like that. You're on screen 1. You press go to 2. Screen 1 is unmounted. Screen 2 is mounted, and so on. The way that looks is we say import create switch navigator, and then create switch navigator is a higher order function, returns, or rather higher order component that returns a component which is the one that we will render inside of our app. And the parameters to this function are, it's a map with a route name, it's a string, and the screen component. So we're essentially mapping some string to a component and saying it belongs to this navigator. I think we all hopefully know. If you don't know what higher order components are yet, definitely read the guide in the React docs. TLDR, it's a function that returns a component and usually takes a component as well. So when we want to go to another route, we can do something like render a button, and when you press on the button, we call navigate on this navigation prop and pass in the name of the route. Navigation prop is passed into every screen component, and it has this set of props on it. It has navigate, go back, set params, get param, dispatch, etc. This is fully listed inside of this screen in the documentation, along with a bunch of other information on how to use them. But we're just going to talk for now about navigate. And we're going to put together a little example that just shows us how to switch between some things. And if I can find the appropriate thing here, that's a good one. All right. Let's add React Navigation next. And open up the tab. Oh, I've already got examples there. Let's get rid of it. All right. I guess I don't need that so much. So I'm running this command exp start, which you saw in the previous section of my speaking, is a command to basically start the packager. Packager, think of it, it's called Metro Bundler in React Native. That's the equivalent of Webpack. So we still need to build our JavaScript and serve it from somewhere so that we can load it into some app that then executes it. Let's just open this up here. So loading this switch example, and I'm going to export the example from the root. And as we saw before, let's make that a lot bigger. And bigger. Create switch navigator from React Navigation. And let's just add a couple other things. View, yeah, button, view. So that's good. From React Native. Let's add some stuff. So if you're not familiar with React Native, Vue is essentially a div. That's pretty much what we're doing here. Most of the styles in React Native are inline styles. There's another way to do it by using something called stylesheet.create. Still an inline style, but you would define the styles in JavaScript. I'm just inlining it directly here into the style prop for convenience. But the other is more efficient. Let's add a border to it. Border color. And let's get rid of that. Let's add a button component, which we saw before was navigate route name 2. Then let's use everybody's favorite tool to make it legible and go on. Okay. So I'm just going to copy this one and say screen component 2. This one will just say go to 1, route name 1. And change this one just to orange. So that does some stuff, but it doesn't actually, all we've done is define these two components. We haven't attached them to the navigator or actually rendered anything. So let's create a navigator. Oops. Switch navigator. And this one was called route name 1, if I'm not mistaken. Yep. Screen component 1. And that was not right. And just for the sake of demonstration, I'm going to say export default class app. Okay, so as I mentioned before, this returns a component which encapsulates the logic of a switch navigator. It takes these routes that map to screens, and then it injects the navigation prop into the screen so that we can navigate between them. Of course, we can't actually refer to these screens here because they haven't been defined yet, so I'm just going to move that to the bottom. And maybe it'll run. Okay, it ran on the first try. Not bad. And now we can switch between screens. Of course, this really isn't that much different from like set state, where you say this thing is visible, this thing's not visible. But of course, that doesn't really scale too well when you have 3 things or 4 things. Yeah, so this kind of helps in that case. But this is sort of a kind of boring example. So I'm going to jump ahead now that we have that foundation I'm going to skip this one, and that one doesn't matter, to Stack Navigator. So this one is where it kind of gets interesting. Stack Navigator is the thing that we saw in the video example where the screen slides in on top of the other screen, and you can swipe back and has a header and all those sorts of things. So it provides this platform-specific layout. It looks different on Android. It looks different on iOS. And the actions users can take is they can push items to the stack. They can pop items. They can replace the current item with another item. Where I'm saying item, I mean route. And they can pop to top and various. Actually, I think that's it. But potentially other things maybe as well. And it kind of looks like this, right? You push a new thing in, it comes on top, you pop it, it slides away. And let's just go back to there. And when we look at the stack, what's actually being rendered when we have 3 screens there is we actually have the previous 2 screens still mounted and in memory. And that's because we actually need to retain the state that they have. If on screen 1 you scroll down halfway through the screen and when you swipe back, you go back to the first screen, you kind of expect it to be in the same spot that you left it. Any transient state in the screen should be how you left it. And similarly, when you start swiping back, you don't want to have to re-render the entire screen before the active one in order to see the content on that screen kind of revealing itself and sort of providing that cue to the user that you're going back to this screen. The syntax for doing this is pretty much the same, or the API rather. We switch the word switch with stack, and we call navigate. If we have time, we'll talk about why, when you might use the word push instead of navigate here. Here's a new one. When you want to go back to the previous screen, you can call it go back on navigation. And yeah, let's go ahead and do this then. I'm just going to copy this over to, looks like I don't have one there yet. one-stack.js. So let's switch it from switch to stack. Now, if we go back here, good call. Yeah, app. I need to actually import that one. And you can see that now we have a header. Maybe you can't see that now. There we go. OK, now we have a header up top. And when I press go to 2, it pushes it on top, gives me a back button, goes back here, and so on. We can swipe back this, etc. Right. Of course, we probably need to do a little bit more with the UI surrounding the screen that we're working with. We might want to set the title, change the colors, add buttons, that sort of thing. And for that, there's this concept of navigation options. And the way that we work with this is by adding a static called navigation options to the screen. And then we could specify here header title is screen 1. And if we pop back here, see that now it says screen 1 up there. We could say header tint color is red. And now it's red. Header style, background color, black. Maybe we'll just make this white. Right. Hides the status bar. That's another thing you can look into the React Native docs about how to deal with that. But essentially, those are the ways you can customize that. Additionally, like I was mentioning, we can, let's just get rid of that. Add buttons. So if we say header right is button let's just come on, prettier. Doesn't seem to want to fix that. Maybe now. Oh, syntax error. Press me. Got it. Jump to the wrong file. Got it. Title, press me. Oh, yeah, good call. Yeah. OK, so we have this button now in the top right. And we can render any component that we want up there. I'm just using the button component because it's built into React Native, and it's super easy to use as a demo. One other useful thing to know here is that navigation options doesn't have to be just an object. It can be a function that returns an object. So this function is provided with the same navigation object that is passed into the screen component. So it would be the same thing as this.props.navigation.navigate or go back. We can also use that in the header by using this navigation object. So I could put navigation, navigate, what was it, route name 2. And that'll go to the other screen now. Another thing that's pretty useful, often this is where people start to think, okay, but if I was rendering a component, I could pass in props to my component. But at this point, like, you're not actually rendering the screens. You're navigating to a screen. And so you don't have control over what props are passed in. You just know that the navigation prop is passed in automatically from React Navigation. And so what we use instead of that is this concept of params. And so it's very similar to how in a web browser you will navigate to a URL and provide something like a query param. The difference is we don't have to serialize that to a string, of course, because we're in the same runtime. So we can just pass it in directly as an object. Or if you really need to, you could pass it a function or some non-serializable object. But Eric might get mad at you. And the reason why he might get mad is it actually makes it difficult to do certain things like we can actually serialize the entire state of the application and then reload the whole state once you go back. And so when you reload your entire app, even when you're not using hot reloading, we can get you to the exact same screen that you were in before. And it just improves the development flow considerably, I think. But yeah, let's add something here. I'm going to pass in a param to the second route. I'll just add in some value, which is a let's get random number. Like this. I'm going to create a function. And let's make that readable. So the way that looks is navigation.navigate, route name, second parameter, value, get random number. All right. That is, at this point, quite useless because we don't actually consume that anywhere, and I can't see my cursor. There we go. But if I go to the second screen, I can add some text here. Of course, I have to remember to import text and say this.props.navigation, get param, value. And then I can provide a default value as well and say no value or whatever we want to put there. And do that. So if I press this, it'll say no value because using I didn't update the button in here, I only updated the button in the header. But now if I use the button in the header, then it passes the parameter as expected, and we're able to present that. We can also use the parameters in the header, which is a very common thing to do. If you're, for example, you have a profile screen, and you want to show the name of the person or user or whatever in the title, then you can just say header title navigation.getParam value. Nope. Oh, I made a mistake. Navigation get param value. Nope. Oh, I think I have to call. So it has to be a string, and that was a really bad error to indicate that. But so now we have in the title just some dynamic value that was passed in through a param. And so that's how you kind of communicate between them. The only other thing that's worth mentioning is that if for whatever reason you want to update the param from inside of the component, you can call the setParams function. And that's often a way that people communicate with the header, essentially. So you might have a button that says like save, and maybe save is disabled, and then the form becomes valid, and then you set a param, form enabled true, and now the save button becomes enabled in the header. How am I doing time-wise?
We're an hour in.
Oh, that's pretty long.
I think that's good.
Yeah, that's good intro. That's fine. Okay, all right. Okay, I think Eric's going to come up now, and that's a basic idea of I think maybe how React navigation sort of works. Eric's going to talk about some like crazier ideas with React navigation and related to web. So yeah, I guess we have to somehow do the mic exchange. That's yours.
Have like this, or you could have.
This is going to work, yeah. I don't need to walk anywhere. Thanks. Is this going to work? Is this like that?
Oh, sorry. What's that?
Very soon we still the iPhone.
Yeah. This guy. Okay.
Yeah, they look similar from far away. I got all excited. That's cool.
I have no idea what you're going to talk about.